Today, Down the Rabbit Hole, Part 2. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one of the latest posts covering finance and property news with a distinctively Australian flavour. And I've got George on the line again tonight. Hello, George.
Hello, Martin. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. And we're going to pick up our conversation. We had a chat a couple of weeks ago, a very philosophical conversation, which was really about saying to people, take the blinkers off, ask the why question one more time, and try and get to understand a little bit more of what's really going on, because sometimes what you think is going on because of your frame of reference isn't necessarily what is actually going on. So we're going to explore that a little bit further tonight. And I know that you've been doing some digging. Yep. I was going to say digging down the rabbit hole, but that might be mixing our metaphors a bit.
I think it's a good point.
Yeah, but I think it's probably a good way to think about it, right? So we're going to do some free thinking again tonight. And people will probably find this a bit challenging. People might well think, what on earth are you talking about? But remember, what we're trying to do here is simply help to take the blinkers off and ask that extra question and ask the why question. And we're not necessarily going to give any pre-packaged answers or easy solutions, but we are going to try and ask more questions, because I'm a philosopher by training and I keep coming back to the why question and the next why question, but why? And that's essentially what we're going to do.
Well, I think you made a good point. I just want to start by saying I never used to question. I used to always believe everything I'd been told by our media, by my education. It wasn't until we had the GFC of 2008 that I thought something's not right here, and that started me thinking, and I kept going around. It was almost like I couldn't actually find an answer because I kept bumping into myself. I thought, but this happens, and this is part of the conditioning that I've had for years.
The analogy I use, George, is it's a bit like trying to look for the end of the sticky tape on a reel. Right?
Absolutely.
You keep turning it round, and you can't quite open it, right? But once you've actually managed to prise it open, yeah, and then you start pulling it back, you suddenly realise, hey, there's a lot more here than I thought.
Well, of course.
That's how I think about it. And I was lucky because I actually went to university and actually had the chance to do philosophy, right, which taught you to find the end of the tape and pull it and see what happened, right? But it's not a very natural or intuitive thing to do for many people.
No, right? because look, by the time I actually came to see you and John Adams, quite a few years had passed. At this stage, I'm actually now starting to look at alternative media, and then I'm starting to question the alternative media to the point where I'm starting to think, hang on a second, if the rulers of the world, the people who have the real power in this world, are going to have control, they must have control of education, they must have control of media, and the icing on the cake, of course, is food, pharmaceuticals, law. And now we're getting to a point where, okay, so the law is designed for what? Who benefits here with the law? We're getting to a stage now where all these things now in my mind are being thrown into question. Now, I didn't think like this before. I just thought everybody does their job. And as I said, you go to school, the education system teaches you to go out and work, be the best you can be. And you go out into the workforce and you see that education system seems to back up everything you've been told. So you don't think that twice. You just say, well, this is the way the world works. And on top of it, you actually feel liberated because you think, well, I'm actually better off than a lot of people in third world countries. And I really shouldn't complain. It's like paradise here. Until we get to 2008, which then started to get me questioning. By the time I got to speaking to you and John, and I mentioned that all the banks were actually, the central banks were printing in unison, and both you and John actually agreed with me, and I thought, well, that's strange. How come the ABC's not telling us what I can see? Now the media is coming into question. Now, believe it or not, I don't think that because I worked in the media. I did 20 years in the media, and I I went along and did my job. I never suspected, not for a moment, that there could be any sort of conspiracy within the media. But it would be very easy to do if you think about it. I mean, it's like I told a friend of mine, for example, about pharmaceutical companies and doctors. And I said, I believe that cancer's probably been cured. And he said to me, so you're telling me that all the doctors conspired together to keep away a cure? I said, don't be foolish. That if you wanted to control everything, you would control the education system. You'd put in the people you chose to run the system, to teach it for your benefit. In this case, it'd be the corporations, because the corporations then use the people that they need to run the system the way they want it, and for whose benefit? Well, of course, for them. So these are the conclusions I've come to. And by the way, for the viewers, in case you think I'm a bit of a tin pot crazy person, by all means, put them in the comments. But you have to be honest to yourself. The things that I'm now going to be bringing up for where we're going with this on this part 2 is going to certainly bring back memories, and it's kind of maybe we're going to be asking questions like about JFK. That's the one thing that I wanted to bring up. In 1961, JFK made a very, very special speech, and he talked about people who were in secret societies who band together and work in covert means. Now, covert means what? In secrecy. So if they've got secrets, well, okay, some people will say national security. We have to have secrecy for national security. Okay, to a point I can agree with that, but that is for the security of the sovereignty of the country for its citizens. But is the security there for the citizens, or is it there for the benefit of the people who run the world?
I can remember I was alive when he was actually assassinated, and I can remember the first satellite images coming across the Atlantic, right, in black and white through, I'm trying to think, was it Telstra or Elstar? I can't remember.
We had black and white TVs back then. So.
Yeah, early bird or whirly bird or what, I don't know what it was called, but it was one of the very first satellites, and it was the first time that they actually sent television signals across the Atlantic, and I still remember that, and that left quite an indelible mark on me. Not so much the assassination, but the whole event around it.
Well, you think about it, when a major event happens like that, what happens generally amongst the citizens? Oh, did you see what happened on the news last night? And they're all agreeing and talking about it. Of course, the media then give their points of view. Everything seems fine. We go back to our education. We go to work. It all seems to match up. We start to see television. Television then, we trust our media. We look to our media to inform us, to give us everything that to keep us well informed. Now, you're getting a little bit of an expose there because you're actually involved sometimes. You challenge the media in many cases, but you've got statistics that you can prove. They can't really call you a crackpot, so to speak. So, no,
Some
but
do.
I'm saying if they
Some
want
do.
to challenge you, they can. But you've got proof of what you say.
Data helps.
Data
Right?
helps. But here's the thing. I did send out some information to a friend, and it was to do with the Lima Agreement back in 1975, how Australia became involved with the United Nations. Now, I don't remember Australia going to a referendum to join the United Nations. Do you?
Well, we were a subset of the UK, weren't we?
Yes, that's okay. But the United Nations, I don't remember us actually voting. Now, that happened under the Whitlam government in 1975, just before he left. And that brought us into some form of control within the United Nations. The Lima Agreement was designed to help shift industrial powers like first world countries' industry into third world countries. That was back in 1975. In 1975, for the younger listeners, we had a lot of industry in Australia. We employed a lot of people. We had a car industry. We had an industry, Lucas Industries, which created electrical components like starter motors, alternators for the cars. We had tyre factories, we had clothing. Now, today, that's all gone. You can clearly see that. And now we have a situation where Australia's economy, conveniently with the COVID-19 that we've got to face with, and the politicians, who would have ever thought that a Liberal Party would actually start going on a big spending binge? But here they are doing exactly what they accused the Labor Party of doing. Well, I think that was more than coincidental, by the way. But going back to JFK and what he said, I believe JFK went against the establishment. And he made it clear that he was going against the establishment. And I think the establishment would have made a decision, right, he's got to go. So he was assassinated. And if you keep going on from there, I would have loved to have actually had all my notes in front of me about where I can go roughly back to what I know. 1913, if you look this up, the Federal Reserve of America was created. That was a private bank with private bankers getting together at a place called Jekyll Island and creating the Federal Reserve Bank of America. A private bank by private bankers controlling the money of American citizens. Not now, what they said this would help because they needed central banking, because central banking would help control inflation and keep a stable economy. Well, after 1913, what did we see? We saw a world war, we saw the Roaring Twenties, and in 1929 we saw the Great Depression. After that, we go on and we have a Second World War. That Great Depression lasted quite a long time because a lot of there was so much.
Just a quick pause
Yes.
there. It's worth reflecting. I believe that the Kennedy family did very well out of the Great Depression.
Yes, look, there are people, that's the thing. A lot of people think, okay, we get a depression and what happens? You have a depression and you say, okay, so what just happened? A lot of people lost a lot of money. Assets were shifted from one group to another. So what happens now is that wealth is transferred from probably the majority of people and shifted over to a minority of people, usually seems to be wealthy people, who look like they have inside information. You can kind of see what's going on. So World War II, and then after World War II we had Bretton Woods, and the US dollar was made the reserve currency of the world. This is all going off the top of my head, so I don't even have my notes, but I remember it that well. Bretton Woods made the US dollar the reserve currency of the world, backed by gold, by the way. And we go along and, okay, JFK comes along. He gets shot in 1963, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong. It was 2 years after he made that speech I suggest that some of the viewers might want to have a look at that famous speech where John F. Kennedy talks about secret societies. You type that into YouTube, you should be able to find it. And listen to the words, because here's a president telling the world what he believes. Now, you could say he was the first big conspiracy theorist, if you like, because here he is challenging the status quo. We go through from JFK and we end up with Nixon. We end up with a war in Vietnam, a very costly war. And when that war happened in Vietnam, in 1971, Nixon decides to defend the dollar and take it off the gold standard. What did he do in the process? He went straight to Saudi Arabia, or maybe not him, but there was a deal struck with Saudi Arabia for their oil. And suddenly the US dollar turned from a gold-backed dollar to a petrol or oil-based dollar. And then we keep going from there. Not much happens, but there's a man in the background, you've probably heard of him, his name's Henry Kissinger. And he seems to be there all the time. How does a man that's not elected democratically seem to have the ear of presidents? Do you see what I'm saying? So I'm just putting it out there. This to me kind of spells, hang on, there's something not quite right here. Would somebody care to tell me what this man is doing, speaking to presidents? And he turns up to Bilderberg. Now we're getting into the twilight zone. Should I say it? Da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Okay, so 71. We moved through to, I think it was 1983. We've now got Bob Hawke in power after Fraser. What happens now? Paul Keating becomes Treasurer of the Year, Time magazine. What did he do? They thought he was an amazing treasurer. He's a Labor treasurer. Labor's not known for their fiscal responsibility, and he's done something to the Australian dollar that was not done up until that point. He floated the Australian dollar. Now the Australian dollar can be traded with currencies all around the world. It wasn't regulated, so it wasn't able to hold. We don't have a gold standard anymore, by the way, and we've got a floating dollar. Paul Keating is the man of the moment. We go through to, I think it's 1989, and we have the recession we had to have. Now, for the younger people, I want you to think about a 20% interest rate at peak. You would remember that yourself, Martin. And they can't imagine having a 20% loan rate today. I think if you did that, the whole economy would just collapse. We would see the whole lot fall over.
Well, to be fair,
yes.
That was a time of inflation, right? So inflation was raging around the world. And in fact, accountants had to have inflation in their accounting because assets just kept rising so hard every year. And so high interest rates, high inflation, prices were very high, wages were growing quite strongly as well, right? So the interesting question is, why was there so much inflation then compared with now? And there's a bunch of economic answers to that, but there's also a bunch of political answers to it as well.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned inflation. We're going to come up to this soon. Okay, so we have a crash in the economy. House prices at that point started to drop. I think as much as 30-40% in some cases. There was a lull. Now John Howard has joined the fray. He's now Prime Minister. We're moving through the 90s. Everybody thought John Howard was fiscally responsible. He certainly made out he was. Okay, that's all right. Would you like to add something there?
What he actually did was squander the revenue that was coming in, particularly from the mining sector, and just handing it back via Costello through the tax cuts, right, to try and actually, I would say, bribe the working part of the economy. So they felt that he was doing the right thing by them, but he left the economy in a very bad state because whilst he might have paid off all the debt, etc., 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 there was nothing laid for the future.
Yes, I think you make a good point there. Because remember, the Lima Agreement has actually slowly pointed us towards a reduction in all our industry. And also, we've got both the Labor Party, Hawke government, and the Liberal government of Howard all talking about liberalising the economy. So I will bring in a term for those who've heard it, maybe some haven't, Neoliberalism, which really started way back in the 80s under Thatcher and Reagan, with the idea being that government should get out of the way of business. That was they sold the whole idea of liberalism by saying the government should stay away from business, not regulate business, but to actually give it freedom. Well, okay, let's go on to this idea of freedom. We're going to come back to Howard. And what does Howard do? He wants freedom. And he wants to support anybody who's got any form of, even if they disagree with him, I will defend anybody with a disagreement. And that was Howard's platform, making out like an elder statesman. But let's have a look at that. So what have we got? The idea that we're going to sell off our utilities, because if we sell our utilities, what's going to happen? We're going to have competition. Competition brings down prices. Everybody wins. It's a good idea. Sounds great. I think, well, geez, he sounds like he really knows what, I mean, he's liberal. He's all for business. Sounds good. What does Liberal Party do? Liberal Party is fiscally responsible by making sure it doesn't spend taxpayer money. It allows the free market to spend money. So, of course, they will encourage things like negative gearing, which will actually bring people into the market. And all along while Howard was in power, I was working at the ABC while he was there. And I remember one day we actually approached Peter Costello. One of the journalists said, But interest rates are dropping and houses are already getting quite expensive, Mr. Costello. You don't think that maybe interest rates are the cause? He said, no, this is good for business. It's good for the borrowers. Lock in a low interest rate now. This is good news for everybody out there. Now, think about a person who's buying a house. It seems to make sense, but what they're not realising is the house prices are now starting to go up and up and up. We get to 1999. There's a president in the United States. His name's Bill Clinton. He's about to exit office. Now, I don't know how this affected us, but I know in 1999 he did an executive order. One man made an executive order to get rid of an act that was brought in 1933 called Glass-Steagall. This act regulated the banks and forced the banks to take money from the real economy. They had to borrow it from Main Street. The people who actually, the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, people who actually had to work for a living. They had the ability to do what's called fractional reserve lending, which is, correct me if I'm wrong, it's 10 times the amount of the reserves sitting in their vaults from us, from the people, not loaned from a bank or another. And this regulation kept the economy in some form of balance.
Well, it separated the speculative aspects of banking, right, from the meat and potato aspects of banking. And that was because that was part of what was understood to have created the crisis back in 1929, right? Because basically there was a bunch of speculation there. And for a long, long time, the bankers were arguing that they were being hobbled by the Glass-Steagall Act, and that as the financial system was being liberated, so there was a whole bunch of financial liberation throughout the 80s and 90s, with the opening up of the stock exchanges and all those things. So they argued that that was part of what needed to be done, that they needed to be able to essentially make money out of making money rather than actually making money out of lending for mortgages and providing banking services to people. So the Glass-Steagall was a break and a control on the proliferation of the financialization of the economy and therefore society. And as soon as that was removed, thanks Mr. Clinton, then you saw a huge acceleration in the amount of activity in banking, the amount of banking that was speculative and the amount of banking that was done for the sake of banking, and it attracted all of these mathematicians and sporty types and these really intelligent people, so that effectively the financial system got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and it created more and more and more value in theory, but in practice the real economy started to get damaged at that point.
Well, I think it fell behind. That's what I think happened. So what you've got is a situation where things like the money has to go somewhere, and the more that's produced, the more it'll go towards things that will give it great return, and those great returns tend to come from the stock market and the real estate market, and they go back and forward between each other. This is from my own. This is not from a book. This is my own.
No, but the point there, George, is that as essentially the value of things in theory increases, actually the value of your $5 note goes down. Right?
I agree with you.
The real value of money, right, is degraded. So effectively you might feel richer because you got some extra noughts after the value of your property, but actually you don't, because it's an illusion. All it is, it's just the balloon's got bigger, but you still have to use more of that balloon to buy anything. So therefore, actually, relatively speaking, you aren't better off.
I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said there, and I'm glad you actually said it, because that's the conclusion that I came to, and I've never done economics. Okay? I thought, and John Adams actually said to me, you're lucky that you didn't do economics, because in a sense, you haven't been brainwashed by the education system, which is corporate controlled. So in a sense, you're better off because you can actually see it so clearly. And I said, well, that's the conclusion I came to. And I thought, and this is happening all around the world. This is leading to something. Why would the world destroy the world currency, the reserve currency, and with all the banks together now linked and printing together, you see stability in the currency exchange, quite reasonable stability, although the AUD's gone down a bit. But you kind of think, this is why I came to that conclusion when I rang you and I rang John Adams. I said, there's something not right here. The central banks appear to be printing in unison, like a string quartet playing with a conductor. Who's the conductor? Well, that'd be the US dollar. And what's the purpose? There's a plan here. Now we're getting into the tinfoil territory, folks. So throw up the comments.
Before you go, understand something, and that is all central banks have this target inflation rate of 2 to 3% per year, right?
I understand.
So implicitly wired into their thinking and wired into the way that economics works is the assumption that everything's got to grow bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Now, go back to what I said previously. The trouble is that actually, as you put more money into the system and you inflate the economy, what you're doing is devaluing
the dollars.
Devaluing
the currency.
Devaluing.
That's right.
And everything gets effectively devalued as the total value in the system increases in absolute terms, right? So that is what's wired right at the heart of central bankers' thinking. And they're still targeting inflation at 2 to 3%, despite the fact that currently we're probably going into deep recession territory. And over the last 4 or 5 years, no central banks around the world, maybe other than in China, have got inflation up above 2 to 3%. In fact, in many parts of the world, like in Japan, they've been in a deflationary spiral for 10 to 15
I'm
to
glad
20
you
years.
mentioned Japan, by the way,
Yep.
because a lot of people have been talking about Australia going down the Japanese path. But a friend of mine said, why don't you ask Martin one thing? Has Japan increased its population? Because Australia certainly has. And that being the point of difference, it's not everything comes into play. Martin, what do you think about our population increase? And do you think that has been a contributing factor in the house prices going up the way they have as well?
What, in Australia? Yeah, so there is a difference. You're right, the population growth in Australia has been much, much stronger than Japan. And of course, in Japan, there's a much greater weighting of elderly people. So they have a demographic time bomb already ticking, right? Ours is rather different. And yeah, in Australia, the truth is that our quantitative easing over the last decade plus has not been printing money, it's been importing people, right? So 300,000 plus or minus migrants coming in each year, year after year after year after year. So think about the accumulative, growth of that is what has actually driven the economy. So in fact, if you look at it on a per capita basis, in terms of GDP, there's been a number of times where we've had a per capita recession, but the top line number is still going big simply because we've got more people coming into the country, right? So that has been the default setting for Australia for a long, long time. And you've seen the consequences of that if you look at the population densities in Sydney and Melbourne and other major centres.
Now, here's an
high-rise
interesting point here, because yes, and go to Western Australia, and you're a stats person. Has Western Australia's population been growing or shrinking? I'm not sure.
It was growing quite strongly through the mining boom.
Yeah.
But if you look now, it's actually shrinking. So people are leaving the West and they're coming east.
And
it's one of the reasons.
Okay.
So it's one of the reasons why the economic parameters over in the West are so poor, and why unemployment is quite a lot higher, and why effectively more over there are already unemployed, and that's why house prices are falling and all those things. So there is a direct correlation between the population movements and what happens. But the point I was going on to say was that, of course, we've now got the virus here, right? And that means that we have zero migration. So suddenly we have no population growth, and we've been effectively on that trip for a long, long time. So one of the reasons why I think the economic parameters in Australia are going to look pretty sick going forward is we've suddenly not got any population growth. And then the question is, well, then if you're not growing through population growth and you're not growing through investment in local manufacturing, which we're not, as you said, because of those international agreements and because effectively it was cheaper to just buy off overseas rather than make it here. I mean, look how stupid that is. then the question becomes, well, hang on a moment. Then, so what is our growth engine going to be? What is it that we're going to do to create, right? That's the first question. The second question, though, is a more fundamental one. And that is, should we even be looking to grow at all, right? Because in a way, this whole idea of perpetual growth is nuts if you think about it, right? Because eventually you're going to run to the point where you can't grow anymore. And people will say, oh, well, science will get us out of it, etc., etc. Yeah, maybe. I'm not so sure. I'm not sure that measuring growth is actually the right metrics of anything important, right? I would want to think about some alternative measures of, benefit or social cohesion or something, right? I mean, I know that in New Zealand they're talking about other metrics other than growth. At least they were before the virus. So there seems to me a fundamental philosophical point here about why are we here? What are we here for, right? And the answer is, actually, growth enables consumerism. Consumerism effectively enables corporates to sell us more stuff, right? And therefore they can drive their profitability, right? And so effectively the real thing that's going on here is that you've got to think of individuals as a bit like cannon fodder. They're there with enough money from working to buy stuff that effectively supports corporations in creating more stuff. And so you've got this circularity going on, right? But unfortunately, the cannon fodder is you and me.
Yes, it's not just you and me, actually, Martin, but the real economy has to be able to support this growth in the property market that we've had. And if the real economy is not growing, and the property market's been going up and up and up, demanding return on investment, rental, and people aren't getting
zero.
The incomes.
Close to zero.
Yeah, the incomes aren't happening. Just exactly how are these properties going to be supported in the end, unless we start to grow the economy to keep enough money circulating? I can't see that from what I'm seeing. I don't have any stats. You do. But isn't it funny how the stats seem to be, well, you've got your own ones, I know that. We mentioned this last week. But you also go by government stats, which I think you may not necessarily agree with, but they're the stats you're given. So you're probably putting a combination of your own and theirs. And you can see quite clearly where this is going. And let's face it, I mean, properties are now getting up to, they're well past the 10 times income. They're getting, in some cases, up to 20 times people's income to buy a property. And so we've got low interest rates, but there's no security anymore because the economy's become very weak. There's not a lot of strength in the economy to grow, to keep the people employed, because the cost of living keeps getting higher, and people have to constantly find new ways to pay for things with limited income increases. So it really, I can't see it working. I just think it's a broken model.
Right. And if you actually look at the distribution of wealth in Australia now compared with a decade ago or 2 decades ago, right, it is differentially skewed between the top, who's done extremely well. They are way more wealthy relative to previously, right, and everybody else. And in fact, the bulk of the population, the bottom 30, 40, 50% has actually gone backwards in absolute terms as well as relative terms. There's lower levels of wealth than 2 decades ago, right?
Well, there's also underemployment too, as well.
You took the words out of my mouth. Yeah, and the other thing that's going on there is because the official statistics doesn't measure unemployment right? It understates real unemployment because you've got underemployment. In other words, people are not working anything like the amount they want to work, and that takes you into a conversation about the gig economy and the 0 hours contracts and the part-time work and the fact that more and more people, particularly in that lower third of the population, are working multiple part-time jobs to try and actually get enough money to pay that big mortgage, because that's the only way
that's if they're in the position to have the mortgage. There's a lot of people. There's a lot of people who are renting who have to share. And I heard in one case in Melbourne, where I live, there were 40 people living in a 3-bedroom home.
Yeah. Well, the
Not saying that's
proportion of
normal, but it happened.
yeah. The proportion of the population that is in rented accommodation has never been higher than it is now. Right? So that's the first point. The second point is that there have never been a larger proportion of people owning property that still hold mortgages. Right? So we've got more people renting, firstly, and then of those that own property, we've got more people actually with a mortgage. And the third point is a greater proportion of people are now going into retirement still with a mortgage.
Yes,
Right?
I've heard this. Yes.
Yeah. So what that takes you to is an understanding that the way that this thing has been allowed to develop, right? We talked about population growth, but the other critical lever to understand is debt, right? And the fact that the debt it's the debt thing that's created the momentum to enable this whole thing to develop, right? And you mentioned the multiple income to property value, right, or mortgage. That's an example, right? So banks were much, much tighter a few years ago in their lending than now. And interestingly, with the virus here, now everybody's being encouraged to go and talk to their bank and postpone those mortgage repayments and just take a bit more, and businesses are being encouraged to borrow more. So once again, the old debt machine is being turned on. The trouble is with debt is this: debt still has to be repaid, right? That's the neoliberal view, which is, yeah, you can borrow if you can get the funds, you can borrow, but you will have to pay, and you'll have to pay every last cent back, right? And guess who benefits from that? It's not the bulk of the people, it's the small proportion of the people, the affluent group, the ones that are connected to the banking system, the ones, by the way, that are supported by the political system and by those in power and the Reserve Bank. So you've got essentially the small proportion and the rest, right? And it goes back to I mentioned in my last show, I spoke to Michael Hudson, right? And he said, do you understand what happens here? As this thing gets bigger and bigger, and as more money is poured in, central banks create more, and as debt is effectively created, you create more and more and more wage slaves, debt slaves, right? And this is precisely like it was, 2 centuries ago in Babylonia or wherever it was, right? This is nothing new, right? This is how it has always been, and it's essentially.
I'm a big fan of Michael Hudson, by the way. I will say one thing. I mentioned interest rates being the key, and somebody who's on a similar vein as Phil Anderson, who spoke about Gann and Henry George, and he said to me, no, it's not interest rates, it's demand. And I thought, he got me there for a moment. I'm thinking, hang on, explain it. And he said, well, look at Western Australia, for example. They've got low interest rates, so their properties are dropping. He said, it's the population growth that's driving this, and that's creating the demand because they're bringing in affluent people into Australia. They're the ones that can afford to pay the higher prices. They go to the auctions, they bid against the locals, and so it's demand and supply. In reality, fanned along by low interest rates and a population increase, when you get the two together, it's like pouring petrol on the fire, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. And that's the point, George. It is multifactorial, right? There are multiple elements, right? So there's population growth. There's the lower ratios that the banks use, so you can borrow more, right? That there is the demand supply issues in terms of the other. The myth is that there's not enough property. And of course, all the property sector people say, yeah, got to build way more. No, actually, we've got 1 million properties vacant across the country now, right? We have more than enough properties. We do not need to build any more. And yet, because the construction sector is such a large proportion of the economy, and because we've got 1 million people working in the construction sector, everybody is still wanting to build more stuff.
I know,
right?
when we already have a glut of it.
Yeah, exactly right. And in a way, that's another example of another myth, right? That actually we don't have enough property. We have plenty of property.
I think, by the way, where this is heading at the end, For all those people who think I'm going to go and invest in a property and I'm going to have rental coming in, remember the real economy has to pay for this. Your rent isn't going to come from a bank. It's going to come from somebody who has a job somewhere who's going to have to pay those rents. Now, if the economy tightens up, there will be people who just simply won't be able to afford to pay the rents unless they get many people into a home. And we're at that point, we've got probably the reverse of a population increase. Now we've got a lot of people not wanting to rent all those properties. They'll want to pool together to try and find a way to live in a home. And we've got an overabundance of property, as you said. So I think, and plus, consider this. The government's about to go into a major public debt. So our sovereign debt's going to go up. We already have plenty of public debt. It's almost like it came at a timely moment because I think the RBA wants to see more and more debt in this country. Now, I mean, we're choking on debt. We're choking on GDP. We've got an overabundance of everything, and we've got prices going up. I think, is the word stagflation something that comes to mind? Where you have inflation and, remember that term?
Yeah, so it's very interesting, right? And you know, this maybe is as we begin to close out this conversation today, George, that essentially where we are now, there are two future scenarios, both of which are valid at the moment, right? The first is that all the money printing here and all around the world essentially starts to pick up inflation, and so you suddenly start seeing prices begin to rise, and interest rates will probably have to follow. As soon as interest rates start to follow, we get ourselves in an inflationary spiral. More people get themselves into difficulty because as interest rates rise, they can't afford to repay those mortgages. And so you go through that inflation cycle again, just like the 70s and 80s, right? That is one very valid scenario. And in that scenario, people say, and you know, there are lots of people on the internet who are gold spruikers say, buy gold because everything else is going to be devalued, right? So, right, so that's one future. The other future is the deflationary future, right? Where effectively, like Japan, correct. And in that scenario, what happens is you don't get inflation. You get, in fact, things get cheaper. And people get less wages, and unemployment continues to be a problem. And essentially it goes the other way, right? And in that situation, you end up with a negative spiral because you get negative growth, in other words, deflation or recession, right? And in that scenario, gold won't necessarily perform at all. In fact, if you look at the long-term trends, gold tracks inflation almost perfectly, right? So in that scenario, actually, the last thing you want to do is to be holding gold, right? And there are people out there who, you know, again, some of them on the internet, who's, yeah, well, Harry Dent's one example, there are others as well. And I think it's fascinating that we've got this potential bifurcation, right? And those two futures are dramatically different because one is effectively an acceleration of inflation and all the consequences and all the issues from that. The other is a de-acceleration, a deflation, right? Neither of those are good for the ordinary people in the country, be it here or around the world.
If
right?
you consider this, Martin, if this continues to go the way it's going, inflation's going to have to kick in somewhere because they can't keep printing and expect. So what I'm seeing is volatility in the share market. You've noticed that, and it is bouncing. It's not just going down; it's coming up. And
but that's because it's still a bear market. So we're going to see a bear market for a lot longer. I still think there's a lot more downside than upside, but you know, could be wrong.
Harry
But
Dent, I think, said that as well.
Well, and Harry is the, you know.
I tend to agree with his analogy because I think that there's only so much money you can pump into the economy.
Well, and that's what Japan has shown, right? Because effectively there's nobody who's done more than the Bank of Japan. They've bought stocks, they've bought bonds, they own a greater proportion of the economy than almost anywhere else around the world, right? And they've got deflation, right? And you could now argue that the Fed is now catching up because they've basically been buying everything from junk bonds through to stocks indirectly, through to bonds, everything, right? So we've now got the situation where more and more of the economy is effectively being controlled by the Fed. right?
I'm starting
Now,
excuse me if I said to you I'm starting to need a Panadol at this stage because because you can understand how you kind of feel like you're going around in circles.
yeah. Well, but now go back to your first observation, which is, so who's in control, right?
Right.
And what's the real agenda, right? Because some would say, and goes back to my conversation with the other George that I had
George
earlier
Gammon,
in the
yes.
week. Yeah, George Gammon. And he and I got on really well, and we'll probably do some more shows.
So you made a fantastic interview.
But obviously George is the key. But the point is, there is a scenario that says there is some intent here. Now, whether it's a plot or whether it is just people thinking the same way in different places at the same time and getting together like central bankers do, but the observable fact is central banks around the world are tipping a whole bunch of money in, right? They're getting more and more control of the financial system, right? They're actually spending more and more of those dollars on supporting the financial system, not the real economy, right? And nobody seems to worry about that. Now, I've got a problem with that, and I personally think that we are sleepwalking into a future which is not one that I particularly want to be involved in, but I probably have much choice. But it is potentially one where we are effectively giving more and more control to a bunch of unelected bankers.
Oh my God. You're going down. We're going to get to this on the next show, by the way.
Yeah,
Go on.
We'll build on this. But that's the point. And then you start overlaying things like the digitalization of society and digital money and things like personal profiles and social scores. And I'll just leave you with one thought, and that is, I generally hold to the cock-up theory of history rather than the conspiracy theory of history. So you will have to convince me next time that there is actually a plan behind the plan behind the plan. But, open-minded enough to walk with you down the next rabbit hole. Sounds as though it should be tinfoil lined.
It will be. And the other thing I'll say is, as I went this journey and I did learn these things, I discovered, just like an onion, you peel an onion and you see something. But what happens is you discover as you peel layer by layer, there's more to it. And then there's more to it. And then there's more. And you think, this is what I thought I'd learned. Had more, there was more behind what I had thought I'd discovered. And that's what has come to my mind. And that's what 9 years of researching has brought me to. And the trouble is, you can't find this stuff easily. You actually have to get into things like documentaries that explain it, and then you're beholden to the documentary. But the documentaries that I've been looking at make so much sense. They explain a lot of why we're in the position we're in. They explain why governments behave the way they do. And the media certainly, if you look at a conspiracy theorist, I'm sure that there's been some that you've probably looked at and said, the mainstream media is saying this, but this guy makes so much more sense. Has that happened to you, Martin?
No, not very often. But then I don't listen to a lot of other people. I tend to do my own independent, research and analysis, because that's basically what I do. But what I will tell you is that philosophy is peeling the onion, and it forces you to continue to peel and peel and peel and peel, right? And try and get to the heart of the truth, right? And that, frankly, is the thing that I value most about my education, which is I don't accept pretty much anything anybody tells me. Call me an old cynic, or call me a philosopher.
I don't think it's being cynical. I think it's actually the way maybe most of the audience here should probably be doing something very similar.
I think it's healthy. But I'll tell you what, it leads to a few sleepless nights, because basically it shows you that perhaps reality as you thought it was is on the blink. And that is actually not always a comfortable thought.
That's a good point. Shall we leave it there, Martin?
Yeah, I think that's so. George, thanks very much for your time today, and
right.
appreciate your thoughts again. And we'll pick up the conversation for part 3 a bit later.
Yes, absolutely. You can play the theme piece.
Thanks, George. You can hum it. See you later. Bye.